Today's class will be covering administrative security. Now let's talk a little bit about security here before we get started. The first thing, we need to create a user or users. We'll talk, we'll talk about those different users and their values, and then we need to apply them to a group or groups. So, once we've done that, what we have to consider is the following. Once we've placed users and groups, we can now apply them to either cabinets or folders and to what document types they should receive. So what we're going to start with here though is first we're going to take a look at setting up a user. So in this, if you'll notice, I'm logged in as an administrator, meaning that I have the ability or the rights to create users. So as an administrator here, I'm going to click on Menu and move to Administration, followed by Security, and then Users. Now here we can create the users that we need, but let's talk about this screen for just a moment. On this screen, you'll notice that there is a username there, excuse me, an email, a first name and a last name that has a red asterisk by it, which obviously represents that that is a required field, at least that when you plug these in. So username, email, last name, and first name. Now normally you'll see people will put in the password as well, because then they'll let the user know, because the user can change their passwords. The reason I say that is because a lot of times people don't realize that they need to set up the administrative login user called admin to support where the SMTP information, so for outbound email. We'll come back to that. Let's first talk about this. To establish a user, I need to create those four fields. The department is a department table that you have. If you go under Menu, Admin, Setup, you can add departments. That's an optional field. It doesn't do anything, but it is there if you want to put it in. The same holds true for language. This has no bearing at all on being able to translate the screens, because if you want to translate those screens, oops, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hit those buttons. If you wanted to translate those screens, there we go, right here, you can hit the Google Translate and select the language. We'll stay away from that for now. So, there's a language table just the same as there is a department table. Next, super user. This is a very important box. This does not make this user an administrator. What a super user does, if you were to check that box, that means this user has to still go into a group, but let's say in the group that they have read only. You didn't give them add, you didn't give them modify, delete, or some of the other administrative functions. What would happen then, when this user logs in, they would at least be able to look at every single document that's in the system if you make them a super user. Now, keep this in the back of your mind. We can assign groups to the cabinet. What groups get access to that cabinet? We can also set groups or individual users to what we call a private folder, meaning that I'm not going to let this folder be shared by everybody that has access to the cabinet necessarily. Only certain groups will be able to see it. There is also something called personal folders. Now, personal folders would mean if I created a personal folder that I have access to it, and only I do. But the only others that would have access to it is the user login called admin, and the second would be any super users. Super users have access to even the personal folders that you might create. Now, there's also here a view user. This view user right here is very important as well. Once you elect to make this person a view user and you put them into a group, you could give them access only, I'm sorry, let me back up for a moment. They will only have access that when they log in, they're taken directly to the view screen. directly to a view screen where all they can do is look at the documents. They could obviously print or save the PDF version of those. And they could upload files to you, but that's all they can do. They can't modify workflow. They can't modify anything. They don't have to be trained because when they log in, they're taken directly to a view screen and that's it. Okay, so we've talked about that. Let's talk about some confusing things here. This right here, SMTP server name and SMTP port, and if you use SSL right here. Let me try to explain this the best I can. When you establish or set up, in fact, I'm going to go in and show you my login. I logged in as that magical user called admin. And so let's look at my profile. And by the way, once the user's in the system, they can click on the welcome button here and it'll bring up their profile. Okay? So, what you're seeing here, let me move that cursor so it's not just showing that. Okay, so this magical user called admin, it doesn't count as one of your users, it's in the system, but here's the important part. If you put in the SMTP server name and the SMTP port, and if you need SSL, meaning that that's what the Outlook is taking, or I'm sorry, that's what your email's using. What's going to happen now is this magical person for admin has now been built as an example. But if I go back to look at a couple of screens here, I want to go back to, see if I can anyway. Let me just click and go. I want to now, as you look at the screen, I will come back to profile, but I want to go back to creating a user again for just a moment because this is why I wanted to, or where I wanted to complete the concept. So, here, only if this user is not going out the same email. For example, we have lsspdms.com. So admin, and you didn't really pay attention to it, maybe you did, but it was using that lsspdms.com for the admin. And so for admin, we also keyed in the SMTP username. Now this is the username and password of this email that you want to have users be sent from. So if this is like a generic like company email, this will send out workflow notices, check-in, check-out notices. All notifications that are coming from the system will come from the admin user. And again, this user could be like, for me, it might be Pete Caruso. This email here, excuse me, and this email might be different. Okay? Might be different. But the point is, this is the one that goes out. Now, here's where I want to finish. If this user that I'm setting up also uses lsspdms.com like our admin, I do not need to fill out for the user the SMTP server name nor the port because it will use the one that admin has. Obviously, they still have to put in their username and password. You don't have to fill that in. When they get to the profile, they can fill that in themselves. When they go to the profile, they're not going to have a choice of super user, view user, obviously, because that's not something they can make a decision on. One last field I'd like to talk about here is visibility. In the system, you will notice that in the cabinets and document type class, when administratively you're creating those or changing those, there's a box called visibility. If you do not check that and create a field, and this user does not have visibility checked, they won't be able to see that field or fields, social security number or whatever. They might be able to see the name of the person and all that other stuff, but if you check this box, visibility, that means even if you make it invisible fields on those documents or cabinet fields, then they'll be able to see them anyway. Okay, so let's say we pretendedly set up a user. Once I establish a user, I will then place them into a group. So I'm going to go here under Menu once again, Admin, Security, and Groups this time. Now, I want to point out a couple of things here, and I'm going to click on the manual just for a moment so I could bring up the kind of the picture infrastructure of the system. If you remember from our discussion, this is a file room, a database. You might only have one as an organization, but that's a file room. These are the cabinets. These are the folders within the cabinets, and then the document types. I'm going to leave that there just for now in case I need to come back to it. But here we go. So, first of all, over here you have a list of your file rooms that you have. You might only have one file room. You also have a group name. So here I would create the group and determine what file room or file rooms that group is going to have access to. So, for example, if I were to create one, a group called, normally you might have accounts payable, customer relations, executive, whatever. But for this one, I'll just call this SEC class, for security class. I'll call it 2 because I might have one already. Okay, at this point, all I need to do is determine what file rooms they have access to. And then, for this group, I want to decide the default options that the group has. What I mean by that is that even if I set defaults where this group could add, delete, change documents, once we apply users to them, we can take some of those features away or add them. So right now though, if you notice the file rooms here, I'm going to kind of just step over for a second. I could select the file room. I have to at least select one file room, and I would select that file room from my choice. Again, if you only have one, you'll see one. So I can selectively choose which file rooms they're going to have access to, or one or more. Now, down below here, I'm just kind of scroll this just a little bit. Down here are the features or functions that the group will have as a default. Now, once the group is created, I will save that. I can open the group then and start adding users to it. But let's talk about what you're seeing on the screen here. On the admin side, the upper left corner, you are saying that as the default, and let's explain default for a moment. If you were to add a user and not bother to change their rights, meaning can they delete and so forth, then whatever you set here is the rights that they will have because you left it alone and didn't change them. So, administratively, you have group, user, and so forth on the side. That means that this, and when I say user, I'm going to just say group because again, it's the default settings, but I'm going to basically explain whether you check the box or not. So, if you were to check group here, that means that this group has access to update groups. If you were to check user right here, that means that the screen we were on just a moment ago, they could go to, meaning they could add users, change users, and so forth. I mentioned a moment ago that there's a department table and a language table. They're purely optional, don't have to use them, but will you allow the group to actually update those? Distribution rule is for the ARI application, which is the automated robot. Will you allow this group to make changes to those rules? Not to file them, but changes to the rules, which are administrative. XML, ODBC, and HL7 are just import type of files. And will they be allowed, they being the group, be allowed to file some of those or let it create infrastructure and so forth? Also in the system, there are reports. If you go to menu, there are reports. Will this group be able to run reports? Doesn't mean to create them, just means to run them. Down below that, you will notice that there's a cabinet type add, a cabinet type edit, a cabinet type delete, And over here, a document type add, document type edit, document type delete. Those three up here and these over here, these top three, are administrative. They are the infrastructure of the system. So, depending on what this group is, whether they would have access to it. Can they create document types? Not create documents, but can they go in and say, hey, this is how I'm going to define a vendor invoice? So that's infrastructure. So can they create? Can they change existing document types? Can they get rid of existing document types? The same holds true for these cabinets. Now you might be confused at the cabinets and documents. That's a different class though. But if you remember when we were back on the screen a moment ago, we saw the file room was the highest level, and then we went to the cabinets, and then underneath that we had folders, and then underneath that we had document types. Now, most every user should at least have manage folder, maybe so that they can at least see them, meaning that if they're adding documents, they better be able to see the folders that you've allowed them to see. So managing folders, they can at least look at them so that they can selectively choose a particular folder. Now, if you want them to be able to edit or delete existing folders, that would be up to you, obviously. Now, let's go to the real user stuff, which the real user stuff is right here. For the documents, you let them see. That's the important thing. That doesn't mean every document. For the documents, you let them see within this group. Will you allow them to look at those documents? Will you allow them to add? Now that's silly, but you might not let them look, but you might let them add, for example. But can you let them look, add, change the information, check out the document, so forth, update workflow, which would be edit, or delete the documents there? Can they export or email them? Can they finalize them? Finalize, by the way, in case you don't know, which is covered in the FX class and some of the document handling, that is, if you finalize a document, then nobody can make changes to that document anymore. You can't version it. You can always make a copy as a new document, but there's no more changes. That's really a compliance thing, where if you have auditors coming in, I could show that there hasn't been any changes to things and so forth. Will they be allowed to check them in and out, meaning that if they have to update them? Will they be able to recover? If you give this group recovery documents, they could go and undelete documents that were deleted, even if they didn't have the ability to delete. But normally you would say, if they could delete, let's let them recover them as well, meaning that if they accidentally deleted them, they could go back and return those or undelete those. Over here, workflow and mail merge. I'm sorry, not workflow, I apologize. Mail merge processing and mail merge template. Mail merge template is an administrative function that allows this group to create mail merge templates, like dear fill in the blank from the document, you owe a balance of field. So you could create a mail merge just like you do in Word or Pages or something to that effect. Process the mail merge means I can run them. So I might not be able to create those, but I might be able to run those. Okay? Last two down here, will they be able to, and this is administrative, will they be able to alter, set up, create workflows and retention? That does not mean that they are a part of a workflow. It has no bearing on it. Those are masters. So let's say that what I'm about to do is I'm just going to pick a couple of user things. I'm going to say that they could read documents, add, edit, maybe they could export an email, and they could check them in and out because I'm going to let them update. Okay, and then I want to be able to allow them to at least look at the folders that I allow them to. Okay, so now when I save this, that's the default for this group that I just created. So this group's created record now is down below. If I do a search on it, I'll just type in class or SEC. You'll notice there's some classes or this one I created before. Let's click on this to add some users. I click on the group name. Now I go over here and I say manage users, where I could begin to add users to this screen. Let me just kind of reduce this a little bit to save because I'm on the projector here. There we go, just for the moment at least. So here I could actually pick the users that I want to add to the group. So I'm selectively choosing people that will be in the group. Let's just pick one more. And now, you will notice up above that here's the 3 users and the default settings. If I would like to, maybe, let's see, who was that third person? That third person will not be able to do anything as far as editing, checking in and out. We'll let them add and look at documents only, as an example. I could also give additional features that maybe the others don't have as well. And I could save those permissions. So by saving those now and hitting save, that's a group that has users in it. So now that we've done that, let's think about the next step of what we would do. Now, I'm going to talk about, once again, as I mentioned in the other class in regards to introduction to PinPoint, there are 3 places that you might set security. I'm sorry, 2 places for each type. Number 1, excluding the file room that you see there, I'm talking about the cabinets. So, is the group going to have access to the cabinet at all? Is the group going to have access to document types within that group? So you need to set up 2 places for a group to get access to documents. If you have 50 document types and you have a group now called Security Test 2, and I give them access to the cabinet but only 3 types of documents, that's all they're going to see. Let's take a look at setting up something like that right now. So what I'm about to do is I'm going to go into the system and pick on one of the cabinets. So here I'm going to go in under Administrative, Setup, and Cabinet Types. I'm going to open the cabinet type Employees. And I'm not concerned about the fields that I have here. Oops, this is a database I have to switch over. I apologize. That was one that we didn't convert. So when I go into the system, if I go under Admin and now under Setup, you will notice Cabinet Types. Under Cabinet Types, I can now selectively choose Employees. And this is what I want to concentrate right here. These are the groups that have access to them. All down here, as you can see. Now, what would be a problem if I picked that security group here? Security Class 2. I never gave them access to this file room. So because of that, you have to be extremely careful. If you only have 1 file room, it wouldn't matter. So in this case, what we'll do is we'll pick that group. Let's assume we were in the proper file room, or we're going to go and update it. You will notice now that one has a check mark as the default group. If you want this to be the default group, you can change those because you can't delete a default group. But I could switch them, so I could delete the HR group. But what you're noticing here is that I am giving these groups rights to this cabinet. Now, jump over to this side. Sometimes you might have a person, Alan Adams, that should have access to this particular cabinet, and Alan is not part of HR or the security class. What that means is that we could add Alan as a user, but here's the thing to remember. Alan is in a group called Other Group, we'll call it for now. Now, what that means is whatever he has access, meaning can he add, can he change, can he look at, that group will give him the rights in here to this cabinet. If you put users in multiple groups, for whatever reason, then they can change the group they're in by clicking on the button at the top, but we won't talk about that at the moment because normally you're going to see a group. They might have multiple file rooms, but normally a person is in a group that has access and they're modified that way. Okay, so there's cabinets that I've just updated, and if I were to save this, then they would be a part of that. Also, I mentioned there was one other spot I need to go. The other spot I need to go is under Administration, under Setup, and Document Types. Under Document Types here, you will notice, I'm just going to pick one of them, Patient Notes. So for this type of document, am I going to give access to that group, Security Class 2? So now they, the group, sorry, I'm scrolling around, they, the group Security Class 2, now have rights to this document type. So what that means is if this document type goes into that cabinet, they'll be able to see it. Okay? So I had to go cabinet. Well, first I had to go file room in the group. Then I had to decide what groups were having access to what cabinets. And I decided for the groups what document types they have. If I put in a document type, say of this, but I didn't give them access to the cabinet or to the folder, then they're not going to see the document type. Now, let's take an example. Let's say rather than the cabinet, we have to create some folders that are going to be private because we have three types of folders. We have default, which means you select the groups and the users into there that have access to it. Private means you are going to selectively choose the groups that have access to that folder only. And then there is the security of what we'll call private, which is what I just mentioned, or personal, which means if I created a folder and I call it personal, that's for me only. So let's look at creating, rather than a cabinet with the document types, we're okay on the document types, let's create a private folder for an outside group that needs access. Okay? So what we're going to do now is, once I've created the cabinet and I have the folders in the system that I want, once again I'm going to change file rooms here if you don't mind for just one moment. I'll use one of the ones that I play with a little bit more. Okay, so in here, let's do that. I'm going to go under Menu, Admin, Setup, and Manage Folders, meaning these are, either I could create brand new folders here, by the way, or I could also search, for example. Let's say that James Killian, in this case, is an employee, and James should have access to see some of his documents. Okay, what we could do is, I'm going to click here, and by the way, when I'm searching, I could even say I'm looking only for default, private, or personal. You have to select one of them. But I'm going to select James Killian here, and I'm going to make his folder private. And I'm going to pick, HR needs access to it, for example, but we'll say administration does, HR does as well. So even though they have access to the cabinet, now that I'm making it private, I've got to add these. So these are the two, and then let's say this is, right here, this is Becky Simmons, let's say it's James Killian, just for grins, and I add them. So now Becky, or James, whoever, will have access to this folder, but so far, we haven't given them any documents to look at yet, or document types. We would have to go in and say it was an employee records and so forth. I could pick those, or whatever it might be. Okay? So I've made this a private folder now. Now, remember this person's name, James Killian. I'm going to save this. Now, notice that he's not on the list. If I come here to look, I want to see all private folders. Now I have access to it, but if I didn't, I wouldn't see it. Also, take a look at this. Let's say I go in the system, and I'm now looking for employees. So I'm going to go in and do an employee look. Here's all my employees, but I'm not seeing any of the private ones. I could click on the private ones and see those. So that means that I can set up private. What does personal folder mean? Well, let's take an example. Let's say I go into the system now, and once again, maybe I already have a folder just to save time, but I'm going to go in here, and I'm going to have a folder under Manage Folders, Maybe we've got a cabinet called personnel or something, for an example. Or we'll just say accounting staff. I'm going to create a folder just for me. It's going to be called Pat Caruso. Okay, and I might put in the rest of my information here if I have it or whatever. But this is going to be my personal folder. Okay, now I'll save that. So what I'm going to do though is, this is for me, so I'm going to make this a personal folder, which means only me and who else? Super users could see this folder. So again, if I come into the system and I'm looking for personal folders, I could see my own. Others won't be able to see them. If they go to the locating screen and say they're using the browse folders and they open accounting staff, notice they can't see them. If they have rights to have see private folders, they could click on the private folders and then say for this, they could see any private folders, which there are none for me. If I click on personal folders and click on accounting staff, there's mine, where I can then work with my own stuff, for example. So, very important to remember when we go back to this picture, you can set security to what file rooms they can get into, to what cabinets they can see, or within a cabinet what folders they can see, and setting the document type. If you have 15 document types and you want to be able to see those, or let a group see those, you need to make sure the group is in all 15 of those document types. That's going to be the biggest thing that you're going to find, is that if you start to use private and personal folders, you'll start to wonder, hey, where is that? I forgot that I made that a private folder, for example. But now that I made that a private folder, let's say that Becky, I think was her name, if she logged in and she was set as a view user, she would be taken directly to the view screen only, where she could see the documents that you've given her the document type rights to see only within that folder. You didn't give her access to the cabinet. You only gave her access to the folder. Okay? So, when a login happens, if you have a user in multiple groups, when I log out here and I key in or fill in my information, normally if you are in one group and only have one file room that you have access to, it will take you right from here and log you in. But because I do have other groups that I belong to, for example, and or file rooms that I can enter, that's why I'm seeing this screen. Now, what I want to mention here to wrap up is if a user wants to see their profile, to change their password or anything, they can click on the welcome in their email. Welcome in their username. Here, what you're seeing, sorry I set this down somewhere, is they could go in and reset their password. They can also, or should also, answer a security question. In fact, if you give a user a login, the first time that they log in, they're going to be taken right to the profile screen, first thing, where they can change their password, and they have to pick a security question, because what's going to happen is, the first time, even if I set this right now, and I do a bunch of stuff, log off, and then I come back, the first time I really log in, it's going to come back and ask me for what's my security. It's an extra layer of security. I answer that question. In the box, it'll say, is this a private station? We remember the last 10 stations each user was at, which means if you go home tonight and you've never been on the system, you're going to be asked the security question again. If you do not check that private box, we won't remember that workstation, which means you'll be prompted over and over again, even if you were at the same station. Now, if in your office you have hundreds of computers, and what's called the IP address, which is kind of the unique address, kind of think of it as a mailbox, if that should change, it might ask you the question again. So, don't be surprised. Again, we remember the last 10, so if you get to the 11th one, then it's going to ask you for that, and then the last, very earliest one would fall off, so it might ask you that again. And again, it's just one setting. What I wanted to point out, though, was a couple of things. This box right here is critical. If you check this box because they're going to use Internet Explorer, make sure that they understand that they're either going to download or you've downloaded already the PDF driver for that, because this is the thing that gives you the ability to mark up documents. If you don't need to annotate, don't worry about it. If you're on Chrome, Firefox, Safari, on your iPad or wherever, there is no tools that will appear because this is in what we call an ActiveX and it works on Internet Explorer only. So, but you don't have to check that box. If they're not going to annotate, don't even confuse or muddy the water. Okay? Also, here is the skin type. Redmond for a Microsoft, Cupertino for a Grays in a Macintosh world. We have a green screen that's Forest for green, Volcano for red, and Sunshine for yellow. We will shortly have a high contrast for easy accessibility. What I wanted to point out though was right here. The users can select their 4 favorite buttons. The dashboard, the add a file, search, and what their home key is. Whatever their home key is what screen it's going to take them to when they log in. So they can selectively choose by the drop down here and then select which screen. If it's dashboard, you'll only have 2 selections. If it's your home screen, you might have 8 or 9, I can't remember, but you have a bunch of selections. So based on what their choices are what they can use. Now this is something that's kind of nice if you'd like it. Down here, let's say that even though I have access to accounts payable and employees and customers, that 90% of the time I work with employees, I could pick a cabinet to default to when I open. So for example, if I selected, let's say employees here, and I could even select a particular folder to open to or a specific subdivider, but I'm just going to have it open and watch what happens now. So now I have employees that show up down there. Now to do this I do have to log off, so I'm going to close out here for just a second and I'm going to start up again. And so now when I log in, you will notice I'm going to type in my username and password. It's going to go right, oops, I didn't mean to do that. I typed in the forgot password, sorry. Okay. So when I go into the system, notice what happens. It took me right to my home screen, which was this one is my home screen, but it already brought up the employees. If I would go to even make my favorite screen the browse screen, like this, let's say I go to this locating screen and pick the browse, notice it opens up to employees only first for me. Okay? Once again, I don't see the one employee, but if I clicked on private folders, I can see that one particular folder. So with that, that'll wrap up this session of the class. Please, let's take some time. There is a quiz that you can take as well with this. And if you have any questions, let's discuss those.